back, everyone. This is part 2 of our Chapter 5 lecture series, this one entitled The Road to Revolution. The focus question for this section is, what key event sharpened the divisions between Britain and the colonists in the late 1760s and early 1770s? The British Parliament followed up the Declaratory Act of 1766 with the Townshend Revenue Acts of 1767, as the British Parliament doubled down on its insistence that Parliament did have the right to tax the colonies. Now, the Townshend Acts imposed taxes on goods imported to the colonies, particularly tea, paper, lead, glass, paint, and more. And it also put in place even more strict enforcement of trade duties. Now, after the experience of the Stamp Act, this new Revenue Act by Britain only fanned the flames of discontent even further among the colonists. In response to the Townshend Acts, the colonies, through those committees of correspondence primarily, began what was known as the Nonimportation Movement, which was a colonial boycott of British goods. Suddenly, homespun cloth became a symbol of American resistance as more and more people began to make their own fabric instead of purchasing the imported fabric from Britain. This was really one of the first instances where women took an active role in politics, as they were primarily the ones who were spinning and weaving this homespun cloth, and women were praised for their contributions to the colonial resistance against the British taxes. Urban artisans benefited greatly from the non-importation movement, as they now had less competition as more and more colonists began to increase their demand for domestic manufacturers instead of foreign British manufacturers. Now, merchants were generally reluctant to join the movement, as they primarily made their money off of the import and export of British goods. However, the non-importation movement ultimately caused the Townshend Acts to fail. A significant turning point in the road to revolution was the event known as the Boston Massacre. Now, this had its origins in the Quartering Act of 1765, which allowed for British troops to be quartered in civilian homes. Now, in Boston in particular, this became quite an issue, as the troops quartered in Boston began to compete more and more with locals for jobs. Their army salaries were not very sufficient, and they also had a lot of free off-duty time, so more and more soldiers began to seek out part-time work within the colony to try to make up some of that difference. Now, this increased tensions between British troops and locals in Boston. On March 5th, 1770, the tensions exploded into bloodshed on the streets of Boston. A confrontation between an unruly crowd of Bostonians and British troops left 5 Bostonians dead. There was a lot of confusion over what happened during this incident. A fairly large crowd of Bostonians, armed with sticks and clubs and rocks and snowballs, surrounded a small contingent of British troops who were hurling insults and threats at them. The commander of the British troops actually tried to de-escalate the situation. However, at some point, one of the troops was actually hit with a rock or a snowball, or perhaps even a rock covered in a snowball, and fired onto the crowd. And in response to that initial shot, other British troops also fired on the crowd, thinking that they had received an order to fire, which the commanding officer vehemently denied at the time and at the subsequent trial. However, resultantly, 5 Bostonians were dead, which greatly fanned the flames, particularly after Paul Revere published an inflammatory engraving of the incident and dubbed it the Boston Massacre, as if the British troops had actually intentionally hunted down these Bostonians and killed them in cold blood on the streets. Now, the British troops were tried in colonial courts, and John Adams, yes, that John Adams, the future second president of the United States, actually defended the British troops at trial and managed to get all but two fully exonerated of the charges. Two of the troops were actually charged and convicted of manslaughter and forced to get a small brand on their hand and were shipped back to Britain. Basically a slap on the wrist for that offense. However, the Boston Massacre, or the myth of the Boston Massacre, circulated widely through the colonies and helped to generate even more discontent between the colonists and Britain. Now, the next tax of significance in the road to revolution was the Tea Act of 1773. Basically, this act stemmed from the fact that the British East India Company was having problems dumping a lot of its tea onto the international markets. So the Tea Act granted the East India Company a monopoly on the North American tea trade and allowed them to dump low-priced tea on the American market. Now, this hurt merchants and smugglers, and the tax on imported goods threatened the assembly control of finances once again. Now, in response to this Tea Act, there was the infamous Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773, where a bunch of Bostonians, majority of them part of the Sons of Liberty, clandestine underground organization, dressed up as Native Americans and boarded the East India Company ships in Boston Harbor and dumped about $4 million in today's money worth of tea into the Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party was not the only protest action against the Tea Act of 1773. There were other tea parties of a similar nature throughout the colonies. One of the more significant ones was the Theenton Tea Party of 1774, led by a woman named Penelope Barker. In 1774, 51 women from Edenton, North Carolina, signed a resolution in support of the colonial boycott on tea and had it sent over to British Parliament. Women, as consumers and generally in charge of household expenditures, directly entered into the political arena for the first time in American history with this document. And of course, the British did not take this very well. This image you see here is actually a political cartoon published in British newspapers at the time, essentially making fun of these Edenton women for stepping above and beyond their social position and basically insulting them for trying to enter into the political arena. In direct response to the Boston Tea Party and the significant loss of revenue for the British East India Company that event caused, the British passed what were known as the Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts, in 1774. Now, these were specifically against the colony of Massachusetts due to Massachusetts' primary role in colonial resistance at this time. It imposed greater royal control over the Massachusetts colony. It restricted the authority of the colonial assemblies. It temporarily closed the port of Boston. It limited the ability of colonies to hold British soldiers accountable for their actions, and it placed Massachusetts under the rule of a military governor. Essentially, it instituted martial law in the colony of Massachusetts. And for the colonists, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. Another act in 1774 that fanned the flames of discontent even higher was the Quebec Act. Now, Resultingly from the Treaty of Paris in 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War, the French had ceded its claims to Canada to the British. So the French Canadians still in Quebec were now under the authority of the British government. The Quebec Act gave those French Canadians complete religious freedom and restored the French form of civil law in the region. It also greatly expanded the borders of the Quebec province to include that old Ohio Valley region that had been the site of much dispute during the 7 Years' War. The act threatened colonist land claims in the Ohio Valley and also made it look like Parliament was strengthening Catholicism in the region. So now not only was resistance to the British government a sign of discontent over the perception of the British infringing on colonists' rights as Englishmen, resistance now also became a symbol of an act of devotion to Protestantism as well. That concludes part 2 of our Chapter 5 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.